Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Last evening, the Deputy Spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that there are 9 UNRWA personnel in Gaza against whom the evidence was sufficient to conclude that they may have been involved in the 7th of October attacks on Israel. Israel had claimed in January that 12 UNRWA staff took part in attacks that triggered the Gaza war. 7 more individuals were added to the list in March and April. In total, Israel is saying that over 450 of 13,000 UNRWA staff are Hamas operatives. Well, to help us understand this situation, we're joined by our guest, Ilan Berman. He's Senior Vice President, American Foreign Policy Council. Mr. Berman, welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Right, so 13,000 UNRWA personnel in Gaza, an enormous number. Does it really surprise us that 9 of them were involved, or at least 9 of them were involved, in the attacks of October the 7th in Israel?
Well, on one level, it shouldn't, precisely because of that large number. The UN Refugee Works Administration is a very bloated agency insofar as the number of employees it has really dwarfs the size of the Palestinian populations that it's serving. It's trying to address a population set of about 2.5–3 million people. That's an awful lot of employees. And so the idea of some segment being radicalized is not a surprise. It's also not unique, because what you have is you have other organizations, whether it's news organizations or others, that have also found that they have contractors or reporters or photojournalists that have been implicated. But it is enormously troubling because of the imprimatur of the United Nations, and also because the UNRWA plays such a big role both in terms of administering Palestinian education and in terms of administering Palestinian infrastructure. So the idea that it's compromised, even in some small measure, is enormously problematic.
Well, Israel, not so small. The 9 of them that the UNRWA has admitted, do have sufficient evidence against them. Israel has actually said there are 450 members of the UNRWA that are Hamas military operatives. Does that surprise you? And how reliable do you think that number is?
So I think that number is probably closer to the actual mark. I think it's very good that the UN has begun moving towards accountability on this small number. But I think the Israeli government has been trying for months to highlight what it sees as a deep-rooted problem. And the dilemma that we are all having, those of us that are observing this issue, is it's very hard to get an accurate gauge of exactly how deep-rooted the problem is. Again, enormously problematic because of the role the UN Refugee Works Administration plays in Palestinian education and therefore radicalization. But the idea that it's compromised, even if it's a small measure, is problematic. If it's a larger measure, the way the Israelis are saying, then this is a huge problem because it really calls into question the entire mandate and the entire role that the agency is playing in the Palestinian territories.
Understood. Now, actually staying with that dynamic there with the UN and its potential for being compromised, and Israeli aid, or allowing the aid by Israel to get into Gaza. Now, there are 2 sides, as there usually are, to this conversation. One is, of course, that Israel is blocking aid into Gaza. And the other is that Israel is saying, well, there is aid available, we've approved it, but the UN workers simply find it too dangerous to distribute it. What do you make of that argument there?
Well, and there's also a third dynamic, I would say, right? Dynamic where the aid gets into the Gaza Strip, and we've seen reporting on this, and then the aid is hijacked by Hamas and is sort of sold on the black market in a way that makes it very, very difficult for ordinary Palestinians to maintain food security, to maintain resources. So you have multiple dynamics that are underway. The real operative question here is whether the UN is playing a constructive role in trying to resolve it, or the UN is really either a bystander or is actually in collusion with Hamas. I think the jury's still out, but it's very clear that both the Israeli government and international donors like countries like Morocco and Jordan, but also the United States, have been attempting to flood aid in there. And there are serious questions about why the aid is not being properly distributed.
Right. So in your opinion, it's likely that the Israelis are allowing aid in, but it's simply not being distributed. Is that the distinction you're making there?
Yes. No, I think that's right. I think the Israelis were at the outset, they were very slow to mobilize aid. They were allowing some aid to go in. I think the admonitions of recent months on the part of European governments, on the part of the U.S. government, the Biden administration, has really resulted in a increased tempo in terms of aid deliveries. There are, objectively, you can watch convoys on the Israeli side of the Gaza envelope. You can watch convoys that are attempting to make their way into the Gaza Strip. But once it enters the Gaza Strip, which is a denied environment, it's a military battlefield, it becomes much, much more difficult to track this aid, and even more difficult, even more problematic to make sure that the aid is really reaching the recipients that need it the most. That should be the job of international aid agencies, and that job is not being fulfilled should really raise a lot of questions.
Understood. So what is the connection between the dangers that exist in Gaza, the distribution of aid and so on, and the number of aid workers that are being killed? How is that happening? Is that one side, another side, or again, a complicated dynamic?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a complicated dynamic. Certainly, there's no shortage of aid workers in Gaza, but the way the environment, the humanitarian and NGO environment in the Palestinian territories has evolved in recent years, many of these are dual-hatted or triple-hatted. They are aid workers, but they're also political activists. They're also, they also do outside jobs. This is a fairly complicated and very fluid political dynamic. Some of them are being killed because they're involved in more radical activities, charitably speaking, right? They're sort of putting themselves in the line of fire. Some of them are being killed because what you have is a high incidence of humanitarian aid workers in the Gaza Strip, including those that have not evacuated as per Israeli military orders. And so, this has complicated the terrain that the Israeli Defense Forces are trying to operate on, because they have to deal with the question of legitimate targeting of Hamas militants, but they also have to deal not only with Palestinian civilians that are supposed to be protected, but also with these third-party individuals of either they're sort of purely humanitarian or they're of some sort of mixed pedigree that they have to figure out what to do with.
Right. Okay. So, it's the most dangerous place for aid workers in the world, in terms of the numbers of fatalities there. What could be done to give them greater protection? So, for example, does the IDF have a responsibility to protect them when they distribute aid?
So that honestly is a great question. It's really something that both the Israeli government and the U.S. government is grappling with, because as soon as you establish a sustained line of humanitarian assistance, whether it's food or humanitarian supplies, what you have is the people that are distributing them become targets of predation, potentially, whether it's by Hamas militants that are trying to, seize the supplies and then resell them on the black market at a profit, or because, the individuals, civilian individuals flow there and the battle space becomes more complicated. But this is the dilemma, because if you are the Israeli military, it's enormously problematic, because it will force you to divert at least some of your battle troops to providing this protection mission rather than carrying out operations against Hamas. So I think that balance is very fluid. I'm not sure that the proper balance has been struck yet, but it's very much top of mind, not only for Israeli military officials, but also for allied countries like the United States that are looking at this situation and trying to ensure both that the Israeli military has freedom of action, but also that humanitarian categories and protected categories are insulated from harm.
Right, and related to that, under international law, an occupying power has an obligation to protect the well-being of civilians. Now, as I understand it, the question is Israel an occupying power in the Gaza Strip? What's your opinion?
That is the operative question, and the results are mixed. But I would point out, and I say this as a recovering lawyer, so I've spent a lot of time on this particular issue. It's almost not relevant in the sense that Israel is still, because it's a nation state, it's still bound by international humanitarian law as defined by the Hague Conventions, as defined by the Geneva Conventions. And this constrains what Israel can do legitimately on the battlefield, even though it is fighting an adversary that doesn't adhere to international humanitarian law.
Right.
That specifically doesn't create a distinction between civilians and combatants, and that actually uses protected spaces. So the Israeli military is operating in a very constrained environment in terms of rules of engagement anyway. And what you now have is you have these third-party individuals that are cluttering the battlefield in a way that actually makes it more difficult.
More complex. Mr. Berman, we've only got a few seconds left, but there is one question that I must get around to. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich implied on Monday that he believes blocking humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip is justified and moral, even if it causes 2 million civilians to die of hunger. But he says the international community won't allow that to happen. Your thoughts?
Well, so two things here. First of all politics is fundamentally local, and Minister Smotrich is one of the more inflammatory members of the Israeli government's ruling coalition, and he's made remarks that have been deemed intemperate, and I would argue that this is one of them. But the other is that what he's highlighting is actually a dilemma that Israel has. Israel has continued, even throughout the 9+ months of the war, to provide assistance like electricity and like water supplies to the Gaza Strip. And therefore, this is a liability for the Israelis, but it's also a somewhat unique situation, because it's very rare that you have a situation where two opposing sides, one is being fed and being fought by the other at the same time. And so I think what he's highlighting is this intellectual inconsistency, but he's not highlighting it, I would argue, in a constructive way.
Well, it certainly does influence global opinion, does it not? Words like this, and here's a member of the Israeli cabinet saying this. It's not, it's not a backbencher, for example. What do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu should do about this? Very quickly, if you would, please.
Look, no, I think that's exactly right. I think Minister Smotrich, as well as Minister Ben-Gvir, the police and national security minister, have proven themselves very intemperate. They're not constructive actors in terms of explaining the Israeli case to the world and building sympathy for what Israel's trying to do. I think the prime minister needs to articulate a much more fulsome vision of protection for the Palestinians and also what he sees as their future. These ministers are not going to help him do that. But right. Everybody understands that every war must end. And so the sooner he talks about it, the better.
Wonderful. Mr. Berman, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. But thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. And that's all from us on this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. As always, lots more coming up. Bye for now.